is Martha Adams, retired Stanford from MIT, active in the Mars Homestead Project, and whenever you're ready, Martha.
Well, Bruce has already introduced me. I'm Martha Adams, retired 10 years ago, and then I met up with these people at MIT who had this idea about Mars, and I sort of got sucked in, and son of a gun, here I am. Anyhow,
Mark,
yes?
you might want to try to speak a little closer to the microphone.
Bring this down. Okay. How am I sounding now? Okay. So, I'd like to open with something I heard just before I came in here by way of explaining something of what I'm up to. We had a discussion around this thing called pessimism. And, you know, pessimism is one of these things, it's a really safe state of mind. Because if you're pessimistic, you can pretty nearly always prove you're right simply by doing nothing. So, I've fallen into this topic of what will people be like a couple of generations along after we have settled Mars. And the context is business. And business is this kind of grungy thing that a lot of people do that is absolutely essential to all of us. So I'm doing this project in the context of Four Frontiers, which is an organization I hope we're all going to hear a lot more about. And I'd like to say a couple of words about frontiers. And one of the important things about today's world is we no longer have any frontiers. Just about every square foot of this planet has somebody around who says, that's mine. You cannot anymore go out and explore. You cannot develop a new enterprise without practically hiring a legal team to explore the groundwork that you would like to use for your enterprise. So we no longer have any frontiers. The second problem that we have today is we're getting awfully low on resources. There are people who can make a convincing case that in today's world we have a population, a factor of several integers above this world's carrying capacity, which has some really nasty implications. Well, a way out of that is off-world development. And off-world development has a lot of possibility for business and growth and profit. So some people have been thinking about this, and the four frontiers that we have in mind are Earth orbit, Luna, Mars, and the belt. And one of the people who has been thinking about this to remarkable effect is Richard Sylvan, who has an upcoming publication titled The Emerging Solar System Economy. That's not Martian, that's not Terran, that's the Emerging Solar System Economy, which will appear in the Journal of Economic Projection. And I've read an early version of it, and I think it's a terrific eye-opener. So when you start thinking about business, you start thinking about synergy. Now, a real good classical example, classical in the sense that I heard about this first in the 1940s in grade school, is your triangle trade, of which, in fact, there have been several triangle trades in history. Now, this triangle trade in the 1700s was a circulation of raw materials from North America to Europe, trade goods down to Africa, and humans back to North America. Well, that was the triangle trade then, as just one example of what obviously had to be a business setup. Okay? I'm not advocating or disadvocating humans as trade goods. I'm just saying that's what people were doing then. So, a central element in this business thing is your negotiating table. Now, a negotiating table is kind of interesting, not least because of the perceptions that people have had of the negotiating tables. As a trustee of a condominium, I had an opportunity to watch a person who had a rather weird style of negotiation. And when I talked with him about that, he replied to me, "We're all in this together," as if we were all on the same side of the table. And I tried to tell him, this is not how negotiations work. Negotiations are a process between different parties across a margin. And this is one of my central topics now. It is, what is negotiation going to be like when we begin to have people out in space, and principally on Mars, because that's where I think it will happen first. I'm not going to go into the stuff, things like business encryption and signed documents and legal structure. I'm going to be talking about practical consequences of communicating with people different from yourself over distances of millions of miles, in which shipment may require months or years to accomplish. It's going to be a very different environment from today's environment, in which you can pick up your telephone and for 2 cents a minute or less, you can talk with somebody in Singapore. Well, so my interest is the direct, interactive business process. And I'm not going to talk about it in the simple way in which I'm just going to say, well, negotiation is negotiation. I'm going to try to get beyond the local corporate cultures thing. And I want to talk first about the Japanese as a counterexample to the kind of experience I'm sure all of us have had here. The Japanese are a different culture. They think differently from us. Some of how they think differently from us is very serious. And it's a bit of a problem to begin to understand what is the system of logic that this Japanese guy on the other side of the negotiating table is using. When you start to look into this, it turns out that everything your Japanese negotiator is thinking and doing is human, just like you, except some of the elements and some of the emphases on the elements are different. And it's this kind of thing that I want to think about and explore into, to think about what negotiation will be like when we get into the future. Now, I'd like to make a few points about differences between people. And one of these is that these differences are significant. James Logan, I was listening to James Logan yesterday talking about being a medical person in an early NASA environment. And boy, did he have some stories to tell. And his topic was space medicine, notes from the trenches. And he was talking about how he thought that people were all different, and the NASA people that he was talking to thought that people were all the same. And he didn't want to get into this unnecessary complication. Well, if somebody's going to go out in space for a few days or several days, or maybe a couple of weeks, you can go out there and an astronaut with all his training can tough it out and come back, and he will be at worst maybe a little bit beyond grumpy. But when you get over there and somebody sits down on Mars and they're going to stay there and they're committed not to go home, this is not exactly a pressure cooker, because if the guy's ready for it, if the people are prepared for it, it can go pretty well. But if somebody has skipped over some of those social science details, some of those soft science details, it can turn out to be a killer. So the importance of these differences, one example is today. You can look at the map of America and you can see that it's divvied up into red states and blue states. And this has a lot of meaning. So how do people get to be different as individuals and different as groups? So I want to talk about that some in the context of the negotiating and bargaining table. So the basic ways in which people get to be different are classified as generally nature and nurture. Now, the first beginning difference is the genetic heritage that we get. And an interesting thing is that two people with the same genetic heritage will not turn out to be completely identical. Cloned, the sheep that was cloned, cats that have been cloned, have turned out to be visibly different from the originals they were cloned from. But there's something in that genetic heritage. And this genetic heritage is not a reliable kind of thing like you see, say, in a computer program, in a well-tested environment. Every time you run it, it comes out the same. One of the ways in which people with the same genetic environment heritage can turn out to be different is something you have all probably seen. It's called Down syndrome. It's also called chromosome 21 syndrome. And this chromosome 21 thing is kind of messy, because if the chromosome 21 gets screwed up before the first division of the egg, then the person is fully a Down syndrome person. But suppose you have that first division and you have two cells, and then in one of those cells you have a chromosome 21 mix-up, then you have a person who is part Downs and part not. So you see, even at this very basic level, there are shades and distinctions. So the second way in which people turn out to be different that I have seen, I volunteered for 5 years in a children's hospital. Am I getting low on time already, Bruce?
No, 5 minutes plus question. Actually 8 minutes plus question.
Okay. And I discovered that new babies, neonates, new people, weeks old, are all of them different. And you can tune into these people if you will be a little bit patient and listen to them closely. You can tune into them and you can rather quickly discover the signals that they use. And I can tell you that they use signals, and these signals are loud and clear, but a person who isn't thinking about it can imagine they aren't there. Newborn babies are people, and when they start learning language, they don't diverge, they converge. They become more social. And this is a fascinating thing to see, and it tells us something more about variation in people. So these babies grow up, and they begin to acquire culture. And this is interesting because your new baby has a potential to become a member of the American culture, a member of a Japanese culture, a member of an Eskimo culture, a member of a jungle culture. It's all there. And they develop and learn this culture, and their brains are made to do this. And this brings us to my next topic, which is mothering. Don't underestimate mothering. You'll see some ugly, ugly pictures out of Africa of the kids carrying guns. Look at those kids. Look at their faces. Look at their actions. Look at their postures. Look at their movements. Those kids are not human. And how does this happen? And the way it is done is it is done by design. Take your new baby away from the mother and raise it separately from mothering. And you get a human-like person who is your ideal killer because he has no sensitivity to people. Okay? And this is important to me because when we get over into the Mars environment, what are we going to do about mothering? And this example, I think, shows you that we want to pay attention to that detail. Now, my final example here has to do with stimulation. You can't raise a kid like a machine. If you measure the brains of animals which have been raised in parks, an unnatural, limited environment, they turn out to have brains 20 to 30% smaller than their wild parents. An interesting example of this in another respect is your London taxi drivers. There was a thing on public TV about this a couple or 3 years ago. It turned out that London taxi drivers who work in a very complex environment and have to know all of it, certain parts of their brain which are known to be associated with memory are on the average measurably larger than in other people who are not London taxi drivers. And finally, the brains of these Romanian orphanage children that we have heard about a couple of years back, who were raised in this deprived environment, they too have brains which are 20 to 30% smaller than normal. So when we get over into Mars, we've got to think about that Mars environment and how are we going to structure it for children. And the basic Apollo approach to structuring an environment for children is going to be self-destructive. It's not going to work. So now I'm going to jump on to now I'm thinking about what are some things that we have to think about in this Mars environment. And a pressurized life space is going to have margins. It's going to have small, tight margins. It's going to have high population density and no privacy. You're going to work, if your child is on Mars is going to grow up in a group home. And one of the things that's going to be required for this is we're going to have to use some techniques so that the child grows up identifying certain people as parents and certain other people as very important other people, but not parents. So there's going to be a lot of pressure for know-how. In a Martian environment, we're going to have a few potential one-point failures that kill the settlement. And they're going to be dangerous one-point failures because these one-point failures are going to be accessible to single individual people. Now, this is going to be something that every Martian is going to have in the back of his head, that one person can kill the settlement. So we're going to make sure that we can trust our kids. And a part of this growing up thing is going to be a lot of role-playing gaming. sort of like the Boy Scouts. There will not be a person, in my view, there will not be a person grown up on Mars who has not passed the test of exiting the life space, walking across 3 meters in that Mars environment and entering the life space again. Okay? You can live, you can maintain consciousness for 10 seconds or more without oxygen. Okay? So that each person in Mars is going to have done that. It's like the case in Arthur Clarke's movie, in which the guy gets back into the environment by allowing himself to be blown out of his carrier back in, and then he closes the door and lets the air come in, and he's able to do it. And if it, and this is a thing that the human frame can tolerate. Okay, you're going to be a little bit beat up, but you'll heal. You'll be okay. So that's the role-playing gaming. So this brings me to the high point of my talk, which is, what's it like, going to be like, if you are a business negotiator here on Terra and you are talking with a Martian negotiator. Okay? The first thing is, this guy is going to be disciplined and intense. He is going to be knowledgeable. He is going to know his business because he has to, and it's what's expected. If you start getting into a secrecy branch, he's going to start to get a little bit upset. Where people depend upon people, secrecy is dangerous. He's going to be strikingly honest. Because again, in his environment, you can't do hidden agenda games and the whole system works. And finally, you're talking with this guy from Mars, you're going to feel like you're talking to the Martian ambassador. Because you're always going to hear in everything he says, I'm concerned for my community. And that concern for community will be a shared concern for everybody. So you, as a negotiator, are going to have to keep in mind you want to strike the best bargain with this guy that you can. You want to trim a little bit more money out of him if you can, but beware. If he feels what you're doing threatens his community, he's going to turn to ice quicker than scat. So this is a fascinating topic. I think it's going to occupy me for the rest of my life, and I'm going to be, the further along I got with this topic, the more there was to be concerned about. So I'm going to post some notes about this shortly after I get back home. These notes will be posted into the Mars Foundation website, marshome.org, where we have a document library. And you can find it in there using my name or by something like Martian Mindset. And I'm now ready to take questions and comments.
This comment brought up some interesting points about the settlement, internal settlement, and the lack of privacy and such. I would suggest taking a look at third world countries. Many countries where reside basically in a one-room house, and examine their social interaction.
This is one of my basic ideas. I want to look at how people are, not as how people ought to be by this set of standards of the day. And I think the third world countries are going to give me a lot to look at. And then thinking, how do I combine this third world way of life with a Martian way of life, where the simplicity of the third world life needs to be brought over to Mars in the context of the extreme use of technology. The third world outlook, elements of third world outlook have to be melded with elements of high tech. And I have the impression that in the minds of many people, these two things don't mix. Well, I think they can. I think they're going to have to. Yes, Gary?
I can't say I'm looking forward to running 3 meters across open Martian space without a spacesuit. But I think you do have an interesting point there. It's not that different from some of the rites of passage, entry into manhood tasks given in primitive societies.
Yeah.
Mainly the young boys, but there are instances where women, say, go through a tattooing process that lasts far longer and perhaps far more painful.
Yes.
So at first I was dismissing it out of hand, but I think maybe you have a point there.
Well, it's a rite of passage. It can be a rite of passage. What it is largely a socially constructed kind of thing. To the young Martian who sees this trial coming up and knows that everybody around him did that, and lots of people have pointers on this and that and something else of what it's like, it's probably going to look easier to the young Martian than it does to you or me. Now, I'd like to mention a really ugly rite of passage that we have in this world, and it is circumcision. And I don't think it's going to be anywhere near as bad as that. Let's see. Yes.
Do you think the experiences of crews on nuclear submarines or, say, in one of those biosphere experiments, are those fair analogs for what we think life is like?
They sure do. Some of my material for my talk and some material that I did not mention came from my looking for information on submarines, submarine crewing. Because I met a fellow some years ago named John Condry, who was working on some of that, and I pulled this up out of memory, and I'm going to have some of that information in my extended annotated references, which is coming up when I get this into the doctrine side, into the document side.
Do you think there was a fair, it's a fair analogy given that the crew of the submarine is all male? Unless, I don't know about submarines.
Well, I basically have to make do with what I can get. And I think that in a general sense, it's likely that an all-male group is probably your human worst case.
Along the lines of analogs, unfortunately I don't have this reference source, just a little word that was sent when I heard was that there was an attempt to incorporate families on maritime shipping. They basically had a full family, wife, children.
To man the ships?
Yeah, it was, their role wasn't so much to man the ships, but it was an attempt to reduce the essentially loss of the men and
Yes.
from the shipping.
Well, they did that. Do you know the old expression, son of a gun?
I heard it.
Do you know its origin?
No.
Well, I will finish this question, and I will depart the stage. Those early sailing warships, they had men on them, they had women on them, and the women got pregnant. And the women bore babies. And there was an idea that if a woman was having a difficult childbirth, that firing some guns, firing some cannons, would facilitate the childbirths.